welcome our next speaker, Sarah Peterson, who I first met back in 2007 at a friend's wedding, and we have kept in touch since then. Sarah has been practicing employment-based immigration law since 2006. She's recognized by the Best Lawyer in America 2019, 2020, and 2021 as a thought leader in corporate immigration. I am so grateful that she had agreed to come and join us from Minnesota, the state of 10,000 lakes. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Sophie. I have to begin by thanking you for this invitation. I've been amazed by the beautiful artistry that last piece was moving, and the work that you do is just phenomenal. So, I'm really excited to talk tonight about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, and I think is relevant in Ireland and pretty much everywhere else in the world. But before I dive in, I found Dr. O'Neill's piece really interesting. I was fortunate enough to get my first vaccine shot today. So, I think so much of what we're seeing with COVID really intertwines with a lot of the issues we deal with immigration and sort of social injustice. And so I really hope my words are interesting and resonate. And if we have time, I'm happy to entertain questions. So by profession, I'm a U.S. immigration lawyer, but I'm also lucky enough to wear many hats. I'm a policy advocate. I travel in non-COVID times, of course, to D.C. quite a bit. I'm an educator, a mentor, and most importantly, I'm a mother. And bridging the U.S. immigration divide is a topic that I've been giving thought to my entire life. And my roots are a little maybe more diverse, and I guess not diverse, is a lot of people who practice immigration law, because I grew up in rural Minnesota in a very, very small town, all white. The only diversity that was present was me being a Baptist in a predominantly Catholic community. So not a lot of diversity, right? And I remember vividly sitting in the high school gymnasium when I was an elementary student, and there was a speaker standing in the middle of an empty floor, and he had a very large mason jar filled with little bubblegum balls, and he had a smaller jar sitting on the table. And as he was pouring the larger balls of gum into the smaller vase, the balls started spilling over and dancing across the table and then tumbling across the floor. And as he's pouring, and as all of these bubble gums were spilling across the gymnasium, he was likening them to immigrants. And immigrants seeking to come to our nation is securing our scarce resources, flooding our schools, our churches, our communities. We were told about those people taking our jobs, our water, our food. And I won't date myself in my talk today, but decades later, this is the same simulation that's being played across the country to kids by U.S. anti-immigrant groups. And all along, fear has really been the impetus of why we have such a strong anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. And frankly, I think it's global. There's a story, there's a real strong need to spread fear, telling people that if those people come, they will take our jobs, our food, our water. And that inspires power in a lot of people. So it's a really long and deep history. And the groups may have changed. I'm speaking to a group of people who live in Ireland. It used to be in the United States that it was the Irish Catholics. And now we've moved to a more diverse group, right? Now we're looking at people based on the color of their skin, and it's easier to differentiate. So when I sat down to try to put pen to paper and try to figure out how to talk tonight about how you bridge this gap, which really requires an informed understanding of the root of the problem, it really hit home the tremendous journey that we're all on. Because I can talk about the current state of affairs and what's exacerbated our situation, but the solution, it's tricky. So I'm going to go through a few of my thoughts on why I think we have the immigration divide, at least based on what we are experiencing in the United States. And I do keep an eye globally. I know a lot of these things are happening in the EU, in a lot of different countries around the world. And so then I'm going to get into a little bit of how do we bring people together. So in my mind, and I'm speaking as myself today, not in any official capacity, but one of the more interesting aspects regarding the immigration divide and in politics generally, I think, is the role of the media. So we live in a 24-hour media cycle right now, right? So nothing in the United States has highlighted this more than the past 4 years under former President Trump. Our country was literally governed by tweets. So news, any news that didn't align with the desired storyline was deemed fake. So now we have this idea that we have fake news. And while Twitter ultimately banned him, now we have a demographic of people reporting that they're bored because without his tweets, there's not that sensationalism, and sensationalism sells. And so now we have this very powerful man who has been able to demonstrate that you can use media as a tool to divide and to garner political power. And I'm sure we are going to continue to see media used as a weapon in this immigration divide. So even under a new presidency, President Biden, we still live in a world where journalists spread misinformation. And they seem to, not all of them for sure, but there are plenty that seem to align with political parties rather than practice independence and exercise verification of fact, because money motivates the storyline. And so in the United States right now, sensationalism in the kids in the cages story, that's what sells. So that's a problem. And then we also have social media. Social media is a phenomenal tool, and I use it. That's one of the reasons Sophie and I have been able to stay in touch throughout the years, right? It's an incredibly powerful tool, but it can also be used to hurt and to isolate. And so the social media aspect builds groups, and it also puts people into bubbles where they hear what they want to hear. It helps them build their little space of safe thought, so they don't have to think the hard thoughts about topics and issues and ideas that they don't want to hear. And what's even more troubling, I think, is that data shows that with the invention of artificial intelligence, it's increasingly more difficult to ascertain truth from fact. And over the next 5 years, it's going to be incredibly difficult for us. We're going to be having little slower and lower ability to actually differentiate between truth and fiction in the media. So in my mind, media is critical because we need to make sure that our trusted voices in the media are aligning with the disciplines of verifying and reporting truth, that the media is using inclusive language, and that we're highlighting stories independently and with integrity. And so while we have many journalists who certainly work from this foundation, I think we as citizens of this world need to constantly push back against those in the media who have strayed from the foundations of bringing truth to light. So that brings us to the current dividedness in the United States. So there's a big divide. And just in this last week, we've had a tragic week in the United States. We've been trying to reconcile all of these unaccompanied children who are trying to cross our borders. They're fleeing incredibly unsafe conditions and traveling hundreds and hundreds of miles simply to seek shelter and safety. We had a violently hate-based attack in Atlanta. We had another violent attack in Boulder, Colorado. And it really feels like it's this critical moment because racism and anti-immigrant sentiment, they really stem from the same place. And this sentiment runs deep. In the United States, we are trying to recover from a presidency that used hate to divide this country in order to retain power. This president was so prolific, he referred to immigrants as rapists and criminals, as not American. Under his presidency, nativist sentiment increased more than ever before. Now, more than a quarter of Americans call immigration a problem, which is more than double the percentage who characterized it that before he took office. Under his presidency, he made expressions of nativism socially acceptable. There's 2 studies that are really telling in terms of how our leader used the public presidency to really sow in divide. So one study showed, and it was conducted by the Anti-Defamation League, that counties that hosted Trump rallies in 2016 saw a 226% increase in hate crimes in the following months. And that's compared to counties that didn't have any sort of rallies. And then ABC News identified at least 29 cases in which violence or threats of violence were carried out. And the perpetrators targeted immigrants or those perceived to be immigrants more than any other group. In New Zealand, so this is the global stretch of the reach of the U.S. president, the man accused of killing more than 50 Muslims at 2 mosques hailed Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity. So there's some real deep root causes here, and we need to make sure that we are electing individuals who have strong positive images in the way that they're talking about people. And remember, this is all despite data that immigrants bring undeniable benefits to the United States. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, which is one of our biggest business communities, just released a report that Immigrants in Minnesota are an undeniable benefit to the state's economy. In the long term, immigrants hold down critical jobs, pay taxes, stimulate the economy through spending, starting businesses, and providing a link to the world economy. And then in Minnesota, we have high upward social mobility from immigrants as they assimilate, and they really help fill this gap from an aging workforce and our inability to really replace the large generation of baby boomers who are going to be retiring. And interestingly, I think most of you may have heard of the Mayo Institute. It's the leading healthcare provider in the world. That's located in Minnesota. And Mayo was highlighted and really talked about the positive role that immigration plays in the provision of healthcare. So that really begs the question. So why, despite this cold, hard data confirming the benefits of immigration, you really seem stuck in a world that really dislikes immigration? This divide seems to be growing. The main point of this talk, I think, was really interesting data, and it deals with psychology. There's a really interesting report from Dr. Nicole Argo and Dr. Kate Jastin titled, "What Immigration Issues Do Americans Hold Sacred? A Psychological Journey into the American Attitudes Towards Immigration." And so what this report did is it really looked at sacred values. And sacred values are values we process as moral obligations. So those are things that we view as moral imperatives. In this study, they looked at 14 key immigration issues and found that the issues were sacralized by at least a third of the survey sample size. And this study looked at both Democrats and Republicans, so both sides of our political house in the United States. And the data suggests that 1/3 of the people view immigration issues as a moral imperative. So in other words, they view immigration as tightly moralistic as they would view selling their children, right? I don't know about any of you, but I wouldn't sell my kids. But 1/3 of the US population views immigration and these issues that were discussed as morally imperative as something like selling their kids. That's crazy. And so what's the cause of this significant sacralization? I talked through, the last 4 years, but this didn't start 4 years ago, right? So they really focus on two main core issues. Sacralization is threat-based. So that means they believe another group is going to take away something that matters to you or your group. In other words, there's a threat to safety, there's a threat to jobs. It's also based on the role of social identity. In other words, whether or not immigration issues were considered central to a political group. So this really hits home the immense influence partisan leaders hold over us through their use of words, their use of language, and the policies that they enact and that they support. And another key takeaway is that, interestingly, people's demographics, so their income, their education, their relations, were not by themselves a predictive factor. So that's a really deep study that shows that people are really, really entrenched in sort of their mindset about immigration. And so how do we bridge this divide? How do we become a more inclusive, welcoming, not only country, but world? Dr. O'Neill was talking about how COVID has really magnified the inequities that exist in the global community. And I think, we as global citizens really have a duty to start now. So belonging begins with us. And I'm going to end in just a short 2 minutes here by showing a video that I think is it was really touching to me when I saw it, but belonging starts with us. And we need to elect trusted leaders who enact smart immigration policies that's based on the migration patterns. I mean, look, I think, Dr. O'Neill was talking about how we can hopefully anticipate traveling again internationally after COVID is abated. That global migration really should be informing immigration policies. And we need our leaders who talk positively about all people. So in the United States, we have conversations about illegal people. We need to change that. We need to start talking about people and not people as being illegal. We need to make a shift in terms of the marketing that we're doing, the public messages that we're spilling out. Under the last 4 years, the Federal Immigration Service, so the federal government, did a lot of things that really demoralized immigrants. And just within the last week, I've started to see that same government agency shift in terms of really highlighting positive immigrant contributions. And that matters. The message matters, and it has to be systematic and from the top down. We need leaders who humanize people, and we need leaders who quit looking at immigration as it's a zero-sum game. In other words, if an immigrant wins, I lose. We need to instead spread an abundance mindset that when an immigrant wins, we all win. And then we need to reach out and listen. You know, one of the other key takeaways of that report that I was talking about is that only a third of Americans have identified as having a close personal connection with an immigrant, which really leaves people susceptible to anti-immigrant messaging. And so we need to think about programs that really help people step outside of their comfort zone and join activities that require bridging and unification. In the United States, we have a really neat program. I really loved it. It was started in the 1950s, and it's an intercultural exchange program. Maybe some of you have participated in it, but it's this idea that you bring people from other countries to the United States to really get immersed in our culture, so that then when they go back to their sending country, they can share that the United States is not necessarily a bad place. I love that idea. I've lived abroad. It really opened my mindset and really showed me that at the end of the day, we all have the same needs. We all want safety and a secure place to grow and raise our families. So at the end of the day, hopefully I've inspired the idea that we really all have a role to play in this, and we really do need to retain hope that that this is a pendulum shift, and this pendulum continues to shift back and forth over the course of history. But it's groups like this, it's conversations like this that help us connect and make friends. And so, you know, I think we all need to step up and have those hard conversations. I have plenty of people in my own family who are anti-immigrant, and it's really hard to have those deep conversations, but we have to start chipping away and listening and trying to understand from where that fear is coming. So with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and play a very short video. And then if we have time, we'll take questions. Otherwise, we can move on. So let's see if I can play this. Oh, is it playing? Can you hear it?
No.
Sophie, do you want to see if you can play it?
Yeah, and Jake, would you mind to play that video from the link I sent?
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. If you could see you through my eyes instead of your ego. I believe you'd be surprised to see that you've been blind. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Yeah, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your speech about bridging the immigration divide. And our theme of the event is to rebuild and reconnect. Rebuild is to rebuild consensus, and bridge is to bridge misunderstanding. I suppose you mentioned a few drivers of the immigration divide, being it media, being it the Donald Trump presidency. I just want to ask, how about the gap between rich and poor? How about capitalism? Because some believe that that is one of the fundamental driver of the social division as well. What do you think?
I think, I mean, that's certainly a piece of it. You know, when you have rich individuals in power, they will do anything to maintain power. And historically, at least in the United States, the powerful men have, you know, it used to be discrimination of women and African-American individuals. And now that's expanded, you know, more towards immigrants. But I do think that what we saw under the President Trump period of time was a lot of really individuals of all means really just diving into their white nativism. And so I think the root causes are complex. And I really think that, in order to bridge that divide, having those really tough conversations is really the base point from which we need to start.
Okay. And I'd like to invite Yutian. Yutian, are you there? Could you please raise hands? Because one of our audience, Yutian, we know she's doing politics in Ireland. I think she's from Democratic Party in Ireland, and she also works in the immigration area. So I'd like to see if she would like to have discussion with you on any of the immigration topic.
Hi, first of all, not so much really doing politics. Well, I'm a party member of Social Democrats, but not really doing politics that much. I am, however, volunteering in a lot of immigration rights support and refugee support area as well. And I did a master's degree in refugee integration actually last year. So a lot of the topics you were mentioning, I did look into them as well. So I think it's really interesting that here in Ireland, I think maybe it's because we have seen what is happening in the U.S. There is an effort from, as far as I can see anyway, from the media here that everybody seems to try to tone down a bit and not drive the sensationalism as much as in the US. I always feel like when I'm watching what's happening in the US, it's so over the top. And I couldn't imagine any of the Irish journalists reporting the same way. But at the same time, you can also see that there are far-right groups existing here who are xenophobic, and they are not hesitant to use sensational language. So it's like there's nearly this competition between the mainstream media who are trying to be holding their integrity together and the sensationalist people who are trying to use fear to divide society for whatever reason. And I wonder, like, is there much discussion in the US about how the messages of not be fearful of foreigners, migrants, or people, newcomers into our society? It's like, how does that battle work, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, this is a long conversation, and I know we need to move on, but it was interesting under President Trump, where when he came into power, the news media was really under this mandate to give both sides of the story equal airtime, which was really hard because as an immigration advocate, the other side is the anti-immigrant, xenophobic groups, but we had to talk to them. And when it's not fact-based, that's a really tricky conversation. I think, unfortunately, in the United States, the mainstream media has moved away from sort of anything but sensationalism. And so I hope that in Ireland, you can hold the fire to the feet of your media so that you continue to get this factually based, non-sensational reporting that journalists should be conducting themselves through.